from Israel's songbook. Most believe that it was written during the wilderness wanderings, and perhaps it was written near the end of those wanderings as they prepared to finally get to enter the Promised Land. And with that background, we want to enter into a study of this psalm. Now, this psalm is a psalm that is in large measure about God. But it is in the light of God that we see some very important things as well about man. And so we want to examine both of these things as we study this psalm tonight. This psalm is a rich psalm. There are individual verses in this psalm that could serve as the basis for our study tonight. We would not exhaust them, but it has been our method to try to examine the psalm from beginning to end, get an overview of the psalm, and so that's what we'll do tonight. Maybe in future sermons or lessons we could examine individual verses of this psalm. But as we take a look at this psalm, we want to see two main things tonight. First of all, we want to see that in the light of God's eternality, we see man's mortality. And then we want to see that in the light of God's purity, we see man's iniquity. Now, it is with this perfect background that certain things stand out in a way that they otherwise wouldn't stand out. Now, we know that's true in physical circumstances. For example, someone who wants to show off a diamond generally will put a black background or some type of background that makes that diamond stand out, that makes it show, that makes it be the object of focus. You don't want anything in the background that is distracting you from seeing that. And so it is with God in the background, with God's eternality, with God's holiness in the background, that we are forced to focus in on certain things about man. Maybe things we don't like to see about man. Maybe things that we would rather overlook. That doesn't mean that our focus isn't on God, because without the background of God, these things wouldn't stand out and we wouldn't see them. And so I think you'll see that as we move through the lesson tonight. But first of all, we want to begin by talking about the eternality of God, and in light of that, the mortality of man. Beginning in verse 1, he says, Lord, Thou hast been our dwelling place in all generations. Here Moses speaks of God as their dwelling place. Literally as their eternal refuge, as their eternal abode. He says, God, You have been home for us. Anytime we needed a place to go, anytime we needed a place where we could feel comfortable, anytime we needed a place where we could find shelter, anytime we needed a place where we could find the provisions that we needed, we could just come to You, and we could find those things in You. You've always been that for us. Throughout our history, You have been our dwelling place. You have been home for us. But notice that the emphasis is in all generations. With every passing generation, God had been that. God had not merely been that for one generation. He isn't a generational God in the sense that He's only there for one generation, but He is a God that transcends the generations. He is a God that has been that for all generations from the beginning of time. Now, in light of the wilderness wanderings, we need to understand something about God. We need to understand that God was there before those wanderings and God would be there after those wanderings. Now, many of them would not come through those wanderings. As you recall, they were forced to wander in the wilderness because of their unbelief, and they would die in that wilderness. I don't know if you've ever pictured it this way or not, but this is the longest funeral procession in the history of the world. For 40 years, they were in line, if you will, with one funeral right after another. Can you imagine 40 years of every day there's a funeral? Every day someone else has died, someone else has gone on, and yet that was the case during these wilderness wanderings for Israel, because those that were 20 and above died in the wilderness. Many believe that is the background of what we later will see as we move down through the context, as we have the parameters of the life of man. For example, when he says, the days of our years are 80 years and 10, and if by reason of strength they be 80 years, yet is their strength, labor, and sorrow, for it is soon cut off, and we fly away. 70, many understand those words in light of the wilderness wanderings. If they were 20, then if you add 40 to that, then they died at 60. If they were 30, then they died at 70. And if they were 40, and if by reason of strength they could make it through 40 years, they would have died at 80. And so here we would have 70 and 80 years. And so that is the background that many attribute to this. But beyond that, it is the idea, and we know that it holds true even today, that the general life expectancy of men and women is in that 70 range, isn't it? It's in that period. That does not mean that some, by reason of strength, don't get 80. Some don't get even more than that. Maybe even 50. Lord willing, if possible this year on our lectureship, Harry Cotham will be with us. And Brother Cotham is 99 years old and is still preaching and teaching God's Word effectively. Well, what a great blessing that is. What a wonderful thing that is. God has blessed him with that kind of health and that kind of ability. He still has a tremendous appetite too. He can still eat most people under the table. And so Brother Cotham's a lot of fun to be around. And I certainly hope he will be able to be here for the lecture program. Excited about that. Excited about the lessons that he will present. We've asked him to present a lesson on finishing strong and being faithful unto death. And he is finishing his life strong. Still preaching and teaching, and he's been faithful. And so it'll be a great encouragement, not only in what he says, but in the fact of him saying those things. Should mean a great deal to us. Now, as we look at this and as we examine this eternal nature of God, notice he says in verse 2, before the mountains were brought forth, or ever thou hast formed the earth and the world, even from everlasting to everlasting, thou art God. From everlasting to everlasting. That is, as far back as you want to go in the past, or as far into the future as you want to go, you will not get back before God, nor will you ever get beyond God. That's important. Because there are a lot of people who would like to somehow get around God. But there simply is no way to get around God. You can't get back in history before God. So you can't go around Him in that direction, nor can you go into the future and get beyond Him. And so you can't go around Him in that direction. You are going to have to one day face God. Because God is from everlasting to everlasting. And there simply is no way to get around Him. You can deny His existence. You can act as if He does not exist. But one day you will be forced to face the God that you have denied. And you will be forced to answer Him. No way to get around Him. From everlasting to everlasting, He is God. The Bible describes and details the eternal nature of God. And we'll notice that in some of the passages in just a minute. Notice He says in verse 3, Thou turnest man to destruction and sayest, Return, ye children of men. And the return there in verse 3 is literally return to dust. It is the contrast between God's eternal habitation, His being the house for all generations, the idea that God has always existed and always will exist. You contrast that with the fact that man was made from the dust of the earth and man's going to return to that dust. And so we see the mortality of man in connection with the eternality of God. Now that's not denying the eternal soul within man. We know that there is a part of man that's going to live on forever. We're not denying that at all. But we are contrasting man's frailty and man's physical demise with the fact that God is eternal. Notice He says in verse 4, For 1,000 years in thy sight are but as yesterday, when it is past, and as a watch in the night. When we read about Methuselah, and we read that Methuselah lived 969 years, I think that's impressive to us. And I think we stand in awe of the idea of 969 years someone lived on this earth. And yet, 1,000 years is but a day to God. It's just a short time to Him. In fact, it's just a watch in the night. There were 3 watches in the night, and so it's but a small section even of the night as far as God is concerned. Because God doesn't live in time as we do. God dwells in eternity. And so God enters into the realm of time in His dealings with man. And so we see, for example, in Galatians 4 and verse 4, that in the fullness of time, God sent forth His Son, made of a woman, made under the law. And so God entered into the realm of time in order to save man. He created man in this realm, but He lives outside of that realm. And so He sees the beginning and He sees the end. He isn't confined as we are by those things. Now, the fact that He sees the beginning and He sees the end does not mean that He forces things to be a certain way, but rather He knows the end as if it were the beginning. He's able to see it. But that does not mean that God manipulates and God forces it to be a certain way. For example, God knew what Judas was going to do in betraying Jesus, and He could prophesy that for hundreds and thousands of years before it took place. But He didn't make Judas do it. He simply stood out, able to see the whole picture, able to see what Judas would do at any given time and moment in his life, and that came to pass. But God didn't force him to do it. God simply knew he was going to do it. And so it is with our lives. He has the ability to do that with our lives as well. Notice in verse 5, Thou carriest them away as with a flood. They are as asleep in the morning. They are like grass which groweth up. Now here are several pictures of the brevity of man's life. It's like a flood. It's like a quick moving torrent of water rushing by. It's like a sleep. You go to sleep, not very long till you wake up. And life is like that, he says. It's like grass which groweth up. Someone said of grass that it is sown, it is grown, it is mown, then it's blown, and finally it's gone. And that's probably true. But that's a pretty good picture of what we are too, right? We're sown, and we're grown, and then something cuts us down, and we're blown away, and we're gone, at least from human sight. Doesn't mean that we cease to exist. We've already talked about that the soul lives on, the spirit returns to God that gave it. But this is a picture of the flesh of man, how frail and weak it is. It says, In the morning it flourisheth, and it groweth up, and in the evening it's cut down and withereth. You ever cut your grass? It's just as green and lush and pretty one day, and you cut it, the next day it's dry. Life is gone, the moisture's gone out of it. How quickly life begins and ends. We're painfully aware of that. And here it's talking about the mortality of man. But that mortality is seen in light of the eternality of God. Consider some passages with me. Psalm 39, verses 4 and 5, perhaps captures this connection between the two as well as any passage could. Psalm 39, in verses 4 and 5, deals with both of these aspects, the eternality of God and the mortality of man, and how that we see one in the light of the other. Notice he says, Lord, make me to know mine end, and the measure of my days, what it is, that I may know how frail I am. Behold, Thou hast made my days as an handbreadth, and mine age is as nothing before Thee. Verily every man in his best state is altogether vanity. Selah. Now think about that. Man is just a handbreadth. Now, that's not true of God. You can't measure God's existence. He's from everlasting to everlasting. But it isn't hard to measure a man's life. In fact, we measure it all the time. We put 2 dates on a tombstone and we separate it by a dash, and that dash represents that man's life. That's how long it was. Just a mark between 2 dates. That's life. It's from a human perspective, as far as the earth is concerned. But you can't do that with God. You can't put a date and a dash in another date, because there's no beginning and there's no ending. It's from everlasting to everlasting. That's what he's saying here. He says, mine age is as nothing before Thee. We're not going to get to 1,000 years, but even if we did, it would be only a day. In the light, and really it wouldn't even be a day in light of eternity. But that's accommodative language to try to help us to understand the comparison between the two. Psalm 93 and verse 2. Psalm 93 and verse 2. Thy throne is established of old. Thou art from everlasting. Again and again, the Bible is going to tell us this about God. It's extremely important. Psalm 102, verses 24 through 27. Because if we don't constantly remind ourselves of this aspect of God, then we will begin to think about God as we think about men. And we can't do that. We simply can't do that. Because God's before and He'll be after. He was before the wilderness wanderings and He was after the wilderness wanderings. He had not changed. He had not gone anywhere. Although hundreds, thousands of people had died, He was still there. Nothing had taken place relative to Him. He had not aged in that time, even though they had. Psalm 102, verses 24 through 27. I said, O my God, take me not away in the midst of my days. Thy years are throughout all generations. Of old hast Thou laid the foundation of the earth, and the heavens are the work of Thy hands. They shall perish, but Thou shalt endure. Yea, all of them shall wax old like a garment. As a vesture shalt Thou change them, and they shall be changed. But Thou art the same, and Thy years shall have no end. People think about the earth, and wrongfully so, but they think about the earth as being extremely old, don't they? They think about it as being millions or billions of years old. But even in a correct way of thinking about it, even if we think about it in the range of 6,000 to 10,000 years, which is far closer to being correct, even if we think about it, 6,000 to 10,000 years, how is that in comparison to God? That doesn't begin to touch everlasting to everlasting, does it? Oh, the existence of the earth itself is short, is small, is nothing in comparison to God and His eternal existence. And that's what the psalmist is talking about right here. Is the fact that God's existence far outstretches even the earth. God's older than the hills, literally. He's the one that made the hills. We say older than dirt, right? Well, God made the dirt, didn't He? He was in existence before there was any dirt. He's the one that made the dirt. He's the one that brought all that forth. And that's what the Bible tells us. Psalm 103 and verse 17. Psalm 103 and verse 17 says, But the mercy of the Lord is from everlasting to everlasting upon them that fear Him, and His righteousness unto children's children. You see how we're looking back and how we're looking ahead. Everlasting to everlasting. We look back to the mercy of God and the fact that God's always been a merciful God. We look forward. God always will be a merciful God. That's who God is. From everlasting to everlasting, you're going to find God's mercy because God, you can't get back before Him and you will never be able to get beyond Him. He stretches beyond the limits of what we can even fathom. He is from everlasting to everlasting. Notice Micah chapter 5 and verse 2, another prophecy that speaks of God in this way. Now this prophecy is special for another reason. And it is special because it prophesies the birth of Jesus. And it prophesies the birth of Jesus from the standpoint of eternity. And it shows that Jesus is God. And the Jews who were familiar with this prophecy should have known that He was in fact God. That when He claimed to be the Son of God, He was not blaspheming, but rather He was merely stating what God's Word for hundreds and thousands of years had already said. It was simply confirming that. Notice Micah chapter 5 and verse 2. But thou, Bethlehem Ephratah, Remember, He was born in Bethlehem. Ephratah refers to a small portion, even smaller than Bethlehem. And Bethlehem isn't big. It says, though thou be little among the thousands of Judah, yet out of thee shall He come forth unto me, that is to be ruler in Israel, whose goings forth have been from of old, from everlasting. Now, what kind of a Messiah should they have been expecting? One that had always existed. One from eternity. Now, Jesus was born in Bethlehem. He fit this prophecy, didn't He? He was from everlasting. And He said as much during His personal ministry. But they were unwilling to accept it. But you know, if you think about it, those Jews were in the same predicament that we're in today. Could they get back before Jesus Christ? No. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. They couldn't get back to a time where He had not existed. Can they go into the future to a time where He will not exist? Oh no. He's from everlasting to everlasting. And so they won't get around Him in either way. And neither will we get around God in either direction. He is from everlasting to everlasting. Consider some other passages. Deuteronomy 33 and verse 27 may be the closest to what we have in Psalm 90, because the same idea of habitation is there. And that's really what Psalm 90 is about, is the fact that God's a habitation for all generations, and He's from everlasting to everlasting. Well, that's the idea of Deuteronomy 33 and verse 27. It says, the eternal God is thy refuge. Literally, He's your habitation. He has been your habitation since eternity. And underneath are the everlasting arms. And He shall thrust out the enemy from before thee, and shall say, destroy them. He's your everlasting home. You know, we talk about someday being at home with God. And I understand what we mean by that. But we had better be at home with God right now. We had better have such a relationship with God right now that that's where we run. That when there are problems, when there are difficulties, when there are needs, we run home. We run to God. He is our eternal habitation. You know how strange it would be to one day be at home with God if in this world you've never been to His house. How strange that would be. How strange it would be to one day be at home with God if you've never been at home with God now. What will make that place home if it has not become home while we live in this world? We say, this world is not my home. That's right. Where is our home then? If this world isn't our home, where is it? Well, it's with God. So are we without a home right now? Oh, we have a home. Our home's with God. And we're able to run to that home. We're not able to be there without ceasing right now. But one day we will. One day we'll be at home with God. But we need to be comfortable with God, at home with God, in that sense at least right now. Isaiah 57 and verse 15. Isaiah 57 and verse 15. Another passage that talks about the eternality of God. I want you to understand, this is not something mentioned in one passage in the Bible. And sometimes we get that impression because when we try to describe this attribute of God, we usually will mention one or two verses and we think, well, that's where we get that from. We get the eternality of God from Psalm 90. Well, we do get it from there, but we get it from a lot of other places too. There are a lot of verses that talk about this aspect of God. Isaiah 57 and verse 15, for thus saith the high and lofty one, that inhabiteth eternity, whose name is holy. I dwell in the high and holy place, with him also that is of a contrite and humble spirit, to revive the spirit of the humble, to revive the heart of the contrite ones. Now notice that we're beginning to bridge a gap here. We're talking about the eternality of God. He inhabits eternity. But now we're beginning to notice that a part of that eternality and a part of where God is His holiness. And so we're transitioning in Psalm 90 from the eternality of God and how it shows the frailty or how it shows the mortality of man to now how the holiness of God shows the iniquity of man. And so we want to notice that. I wish we had time to notice all the verses that talk about the brevity of life. One I want you to notice, because it's one I'd never noticed before, is Job 24 and verse 24. Job 24 and verse 24. I'd never read this one before. I've talked about the brevity of life before, and I've used a number of pictures, but I thought at least this one was new to me. It may be new to you. It says, "They are exalted for a little while, but are gone and brought low. They are taken out of the way as all other, and cut off as the tops of the ears of corn." We probably think about corn in the sense of ears of corn. And I can remember even in shucking ears of corn and whatever that, the top, it usually doesn't fill out all the way up to the top. And so you'd whack off the top of the corn. I don't really think that's what it's talking about. That's what our minds go to because that's what we know. It likely has reference to the wheat and taking off the top, the head of the wheat. But think about how easy it is just to break off the top of that wheat. That's a picture of how frail and how short the life of man is. Think about wheat springing up and just that quickly you're breaking off the top and it's gone. Just stubble left in the field. And so it is with man's existence here on this earth. But in the light of God's purity, we see man's iniquity. We don't have time to notice a lot, but notice Psalm 90. Psalm 90, and you'll see that he says in verse 8, "Thou hast set our iniquities before Thee, our secret sins in the light of Thy countenance." There are opportunities and times in this life where perhaps we can hide our iniquities, we can cover our sins to where they're not visible to people around us. But in the perfect light of eternity, in the perfect light of God, there will be no hiding those. You go to the airport, they make you pass through an X-ray machine, right? Hard to hide something when they're X-raying. And that's just an X-ray. That's not the eyes of God. You're not going to be able to hide anything from God. All is going to be visible. Have you ever seen, and you probably have on some of the shows on television, the use of a black light or something like that, where things that you can't see with the naked eye, when the lights are cut off and a black light is used, that they glow. You can see them, whether it's blood, whether you're using luminol or something else to bring out that, or whatever it may be. It shows. Well, the image here is, here's a person who appears to be spotless by human eyes, by earthly standards, and yet when they stand in the pure light of heaven, those spots are going to be obvious. They're going to be seen. And we see our iniquity in the light of God's purity. When you put us against that perfect white background, then if there is sin there, it will show. In Isaiah chapter 6, I want you to notice what Isaiah says, and we'll have to stop with this passage. But Isaiah 6, Isaiah was lifted up, found himself in the presence of God, and he heard the angels crying one to another, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord our Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of His glory." And notice in verse 5 what Isaiah says. Now Isaiah was a good man. He was a prophet. He was a man who God was using. But it says, "Then said I, Woe is me, for I am undone, Because I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips. For mine eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. How did Isaiah feel when he found himself in the presence of God and His holy angels? He said, I'm undone. He looked like a slouch in the presence of heaven's light. He said, my lips are unclean. I dwell among people who are unclean. And I know just being around them, at least to some degree, is rubbed off on me. And in heaven's light, that becomes very, very, very clear. Now, the point that I'm making here is, life is short in comparison to the eternality of God. Why would we waste our time trying to cover something that we're never going to be able to cover? You think about the amount of time that people spend in trying to cover their tracks. They spend in trying to cover their sin. And yet ultimately, there's no hiding it. You can't cover it. Moses knew that. Moses is the one, of course, by the inspiration of God that said, be sure what? Your sin will find you out. You can't hide it. Achan couldn't hide his. He could bury it beneath his tent, but he couldn't hide it. And in like manner, you can't do that either. And so realizing the eternality of God and the purity of God, recognize your own mortality, recognize your own iniquity, and do what's necessary to be right with God. Thank you very much for your attention tonight. I know Andy has the devotion here, but I don't know.